Congruent shapes have the same size and the same shape. In other words, they are exactly the same. The length of all the sides will be the same, and the angles will all be the same. So these two triangles here are an example of two congruent triangles. Same length of each sides and same angles. Sometimes you'll see measurements that help you to determine whether something is congruent or not. And in this case, these two rectangles, because they have the exact same measurements, two sides which are 1 unit of measure each, and two sides which are 2 units of measure each. And then of course with the rectangles we have all 4 right angles, or 90-degree angles, and so we know that these two rectangles are congruent. Same lengths of all the sides and same angles. These two triangles are shown to be congruent as well. Same length of the sides and the angles are all the same. These two angles are both marked as 90-degree angles. These two angles are both marked as 30-degree angles, and so we know that these two angles have to be 60-degree angles to make up the 180 degrees of a triangle. So these two triangles are congruent. Same length of sides, same measurement of angles. Sometimes two shapes are congruent, but one of the shapes is rotated so they don't look the same. When you're looking for congruent shapes, check and see if one of the shapes might be rotated. So, for example, I have here two congruent triangles. These two triangles are both exactly the same. Now, it's easy to see that when they're sitting right next to each other at the exact same position. But if one of these triangles were rotated and looked like this, I might look at it and think, oh no, those aren't congruent triangles. But if I rotated and I could see that they are congruent, then I would be able to tell that they have the exact same measurement and the exact same angles, the exact same measurements of the sides and the exact same angles. Similarly, if I had two rectangles and they're right up next to one another in the same position, then I can see that they're congruent. But if the problem was given to me like this, I might look at it at first and think, oh no, those two aren't congruent. Their measurements of their sides aren't the same. But look at the figure rotated and see if indeed they are two congruent shapes. Two shapes that have the same shape but different sizes are called similar. Similar shapes are not congruent because they're not the same size. In order for two shapes to be congruent, they have to be exactly the same. Same shape, same size. So here is an example of two circles. One is very small and one is a little bit larger. They're the same shape, they're both circles, but they're not the same size. So they're not congruent, but they're what we would call similar. These two shapes are similar. And then here we've got two squares, and we're asked the question, are these squares congruent, similar, or neither? Well, we know that they're not congruent because they're not the same size. All four sides would have to have the exact same measurement, the same length, in order for them to be two congruent squares. But they are similar because they are both squares. And so if two shapes are the same shape, but not the same size, we call them similar. So the answer to our question here is that these two squares are similar. Although so far we have only looked at simple shapes like squares, circles, triangles, rectangles, we can also look at more complex shapes and ask the same question. Are these shapes similar, congruent, or neither? So I have a couple little more complex shapes here in the shape of a star, and I need to see if they're similar or congruent. I have the advantage here of being able to take off one of these little stars and compare it to the other one. But like we were talking about before with rotations, we would want to rotate this to see if we can get it in the same position as the other one, and then compare our angles and our lengths of sides. And these two shapes are exactly the same. They have the same angles and the same length of sides. And so I can see in this case, even with a more complex shape, that I can confidently say that these two shapes are exactly the same measurement, exactly the same shape as each other, and therefore they are congruent. Let's take a look at one more example of comparing shapes. So again, we're asked, are these shapes congruent, similar, or neither? Now, when we look at these two triangles, we can see that they're very differently shaped triangles with different angles. This triangle is a right triangle, meaning that one of its angles is a right angle. And in this triangle, that's not the case. We don't have any right angles in this triangle. So we know their angles aren't the same. Although they are both triangles about the same height, since their angles are different, they're not the same shape. So they're not congruent because they're not exactly the same shape. They're not similar because they have different angles, which makes them not the same shaped triangle. And so in this case, we would say that these two triangles are neither congruent nor similar.